All right, good morning. This is First Things at First Pres. As I said yesterday, we're going to look at the Israeli uh, attacks and the ongoing war with Hamas. Put in the perspective of how do we think about this as people of faith. There's so much to unpack here, not just the reaction to the horrors of the last few days, but in general, anytime anything happens in Israel, we got to deal with Christians, certain segments of the Christian population. Talking about the end times and the return of Jesus. On the other side of it, you got progressive Christians that tend to be very sympathetic towards the Palestinians. Again, it's a tendency, it's not monolithic, but there's a lot that needs to be discussed. A little bit of history, but a lot of kind of the whole point here is to, again, get you to think about all life, culture. Last week it was about Barbie. A little bit trivial compared to what we're going to talk about today, but it's in all things. How do we take in the events of the world, not just react to CNN or Fox or whatever, but how do we think through these things deliberatively as Christians? And I'll begin with just a general comment about again, just talking about the superiority of Presbyterian or Reformed theology when it comes to dealing with human nature, all these kinds of issues. It gets a bum rap sometimes, the concept of total depravity, which lies at the heart of a lot of Calvin's thought. But, Calvin, I think rightly so, drawing upon, obviously, the wealth of Scripture, specifically, getting kind of caught up in Paul's writings, in particular Romans, but not only Romans, but just this view that the human being is utterly corrupted by sin. That it's a naivete to say that there's a certain part of the human being, a certain spark in the human being that has some capacity towards good. That doesn't mean that, again, that we don't do good things. You talk about self-interest. We love our families. We protect our families. We are benevolent when we are able to. It doesn't mean human beings aren't capable of doing at times the right things for the right reason, but it does mean that there isn't a part of the human being that isn't corrupted by sin. Our hearts, our minds, our actions, we are all capable of that. And the idea that humanity as a whole, not just me as an individual, but humanity as a whole, it means that a few things. One is we ought not, as Presbyterians, to ever have a naive view of human nature. I was listening to something last week where we were talking about that human beings in general are, benevolent. That's kind of the overall, just broad stroke, the evangelical view of human beings. And by the way, it's also the view of the far left too. And Christians, there's this idea that human beings are basically good. We've got a few flaws, but if we get those flaws corrected, we'll be on the right path. And that's kind of anathema to Calvin. The idea is the human beings are not just flawed; we are corrupted. It is an interesting kind of parallel to computer programming language. If you have a corrupted file, no matter what you do, that file that until that corruption is fixed, in most cases the file is unusable. And that's kind of what the Bible says. It doesn't mean that occasionally you don't find good actions happening from everybody. We're all capable of doing good things. It's why Paul even talks about our good deeds almost in some ways condemn us already, because we show that we are capable of doing of occasionally doing these beneficial things, but it's fundamentally at a human nature level. It's to explain. You look at Hamas and you see these horrific images of women and children not only being murdered but brutalized in the worst cases. There was a situation, one of the videos I saw had a little boy, probably 8 years old, and the adults gave it was almost like looking at a Discovery Channel thing about predators, right? I've seen images of lions and cheetahs with their young, and when they've got when they've caught something that's still alive, they'll give it to their young to bat around and to play with, to learn how to be a predator. Well, this is exactly one of the videos that I saw over the weekend. Was this little boy, somewhere between 6, 7, 8 years old, and they gave him to like a group of 8 or so Palestinian boys for them to torment. You ask yourselves, how can human beings behave in that way? These are these are all kids. They could have all been playing together just as easily. And it goes back to, I guess the easiest parallels to go back to Germany in the 1930s is how do you account for an entire nation of people turning on their neighbors and sometimes friends and coworkers? When you look at what the Nazis ended up doing with Jews, and not just Jews, homosexuals and artists and people that were on the fringes of society, the Romani or the Gypsies, those were all persecuted by the SS and the Nazis. And, not only did you have neighbors turning a blind eye, in many cases they turned an active eye towards rounding these people up. And it begs the question, if you lived in a village right adjacent to, Auschwitz, how, the level of plausible deniability. You're seeing the trains, thousands of people, men, women, children coming in, and the ovens being, being lit up, and that raises that question of how do civilized human beings behave so uncivilized? And there's your answer, at least in our theological tradition, is embracing the fact that we are not fundamentally good. We are fundamentally sinful. And once we understand that, then we are actually more useful to God, because we come to him in a state of dependence. Lord, make me who I am not. Paul even literally says that. The good that I want to do, I don't do. What I want to stop doing, I struggle with. That is the kind of the reformed view of human nature, and I think it's very important that we see that. When we see comments, how is it that you have these videos of death and destruction, and then you look at New York City, for example, and other places throughout the world where pro-Palestinian groups are just taunting and celebrating and kind of echoing that death to Israel kind of thing. So there's just, to begin with, you'll be better off theologically, better off in through life, because if you believe in this concept of total depravity, you won't be naive when you see human beings behaving horrifically. And there is that reminder that even the best of us are corrupted by sin, which means that even the best of us are capable of horrific things. And it is, Calvin looked at a couple of things. One was, the dependence of the believer on God that helps change our heart, our orientation. And then the other one is that there's a concept that Calvin has of how the God will allow cultures to show restraint. Calvin believing that God decided in eternity who was his and who wasn't. Tried to answer that question of, well, what value is church or faith to someone that might not be in the chosen, and it was about restraint. There was a society without restraint, as we're seeing, falls apart. When you're looking at the current Israel-Hamas thing, the Hamas attacks last week came as a surprise. Which does beg questions that will have to be answered at some point about Israeli intelligence. But more importantly is where was American intelligence? We are Israel's one of their major benefactors. We give them billions of dollars of military aid every year. We provide diplomatic support all the time. We provide intelligence support all the time. And so it wasn't only a failure of the Israeli intelligence agencies, but also of the United States intelligence agencies. Or maybe it wasn't a failure. Maybe, given the state of our government, maybe it was, either just, again, that's kind of naivete. There's this idea that there's this noble struggle in Palestine for, quote, freedom. And I think some of that needs to be disabused too. Hamas has always been an evil organization filled with evil people. And it's important to understand that the Palestinians elected Hamas in 2005 to be their government. Again, I can't speak to the fairness of the election, but we'll get to that in a second. So, again, when you look at what's happening right now, you're seeing the whole kind of picture of the last 80 years, 70 years. Israel became a nation in 1947, 48. And it's an interesting thing, right? We'll start there, I guess, is just a brief history here, because again, there's this context that sometimes you see United Nations is a big factor of this. And I've hit this before, but if there's ever a time where we ought to, we talk about defunding and dismantling organizations. If ever there's an organization that has fundamentally failed in its purpose, it's the United Nations. The United Nations was set up. It was it was a step, an evolution of the League of Nations, which itself was a failure. But the UN's record, over the last 60, 70 years has been abysmal. You're talking about peacekeepers that not only are taking bribes and raping and pillaging and doing all this stuff time and time and time again, but the fundamental purpose, which is to stop war, is something that they don't do. They take sides rather than being truly neutral. We set it up for failure when we gave veto rights to certain organizations that, like China and Russia and even the United States. When you put Iran and you put some of the most horrific abusers of human rights on the Human Rights Council, that's enough to tell you. But if there's ever a time, even right now, we have known that Gaza in particular has been a powder keg since it was given to them in 2005, and we'll get to that. Brief history, right? Let's do this real quick. So, part of what needs to be understood here with all the conflict and everything is the failure of the British government, the United Kingdom, to provide a wise exit solution to their colonialism of the 18th and 19th centuries, right? British, they weren't the only ones, but the British, took over however much of the world, big swaths. They had the British mandate that ruled the Middle East. You had, the British were in what's now India and Pakistan. The British were all over the United States, right? Canada. So, but many times when the United Kingdom started to move out of these places that suddenly went from places they could exploit to now they wanted an exit strategy. When you look at India, when they left India, and that country devolved into civil war, and you ended up seeing not only death and destruction, but ultimately the Muslim population had to leave their ancestral homes and flee and go to north to create what is now Pakistan, because they were being brutalized by some of the Hindu mob there. When you look at some of Eastern Europe, when you look at the Middle East, right? You look at Iran and Iraq, and you look at some of the other tribal groups that are in there. It's important to understand that these regions were tribalized. The United Kingdom came in, and when the British came in, they established government. They established order at the expense of human dignity and freedom. But when they left, a lot of boundaries, a lot of nation boundaries were just arbitrarily drawn. When you look at the Middle Eastern maps and see what became Jordan, Iran, Iraq, UAE, all these things, it was just kind of arbitrary lines on a map that in general favored majority tribal populations at the expense of others. And so you see the same thing. So, you look at some of these modern countries, Jordan, Jordan had ostensibly had control over the what becomes Israel, Palestine, if you want to call it. But that whole region was called Palestine. Palestine was this region that included what was called Transjordan, which was now the nation of Jordan, beyond the Jordan River. When you look at your biblical history, the biblical history of Israel transcends both sides of the Jordan. It's still believed that the burial of Moses, Moses never was allowed to cross the Jordan River. So the burial of Moses, the site of his burial is Mount Nebo in Jordan. There's this fuzziness. But anyways, the modern boundary lines were all created as Britain began to pull, in the United Kingdom, began to pull out of all these places they invaded, and they just left a mess. And that was what happened here. So 1948, the British pull out. And they gave warnings, by the way. Everyone thinks of Israel being an invading army. Israel, was warned that when the British pulled out, they did not arm Israel. Everyone knew that as soon as the British left, that Israel was on its own and nobody gave them a chance. In fact, they were warned to flee before the last of the British protectorate left. One of the interesting things, and you look at the history of that war, 1948 Arab-Israel War, it is shocking that Israel won that. But they were, it's when you've got part of this is you can talk about providence if you want to, but looking at just from a human perspective was, they ended up having, the weapons they needed as they reacted to being attacked. They acquired more as they were defeating some of their enemies. Some of their enemies didn't have the same stomach that they did. You got to be willing to die for what you believe. And for Israel, this was land that they weren't going to give up. And it's also important to understand is it's not like in 1948 or 1947, a whole bunch of Jews showed up in Israel saying, hey, can we have a homeland? Starting in late 18th century, but certainly 1909 is the date of the first kibbutz. Kibbutz is, a collective. Basically, it's localized communism, but it is a group of Jews legally bought land. They moved into that land and they started this process of claiming it, reclaiming it. A lot of this was swamp land. They've had to fight malaria. They had to fight Arabs that wanted them not even to take root there. But important to understand that Jews were moving into Israel, and they were doing it legally. They were buying this land legally. Tel Aviv is a good example. You can Google it. Tel Aviv was bought, 12 or 13 families ended up pooling their money. They bought the land. They divided the city up into areas that they would own, and they controlled it. And so a lot of Israel was bought legally. And more and more Jews started to come in. And then you have, again, the messiness post-World War II, where we know that some of the nations refused to take Jewish populations back, even after the Holocaust. Jews were left without land, without property. And for a lot of the post-war Europe, United States, communist bloc nations, Israel became a convenient dumping ground for all these Jewish population groups that they didn't want back. They didn't want the Jewish people coming back to their homes. And so this creating Israel was, let's be honest, it was a convenient, for all these European governments that are now, always voting against Israel and talking about how bad Israel is. They empowered Israel. They gave them the land because they honestly didn't want them coming back. And so they created kind of the problem. But you had 1948, right? From 1948 to 1967, Jordan, what became Jordan, that government had control of Jerusalem. In 1967, again, the provocation was on the Arab side, Egypt. Both of these things. Egypt was the instigator until after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when they finally got some peace terms settled. But Egypt, what you now call Jordan, Syria, they were all engaged. Syria from the north, Jordan from the east, Egypt from the south. That Israel was surrounded by their enemies, and yet every time has sustained themselves and survived, and not only survived but thrived. But 1967, they take Jerusalem, and when they take, because you look at the original UN map for Israel, it did not include Jerusalem. And but this is the thing, the messiness. Prior to 1948, Jews, Arab Christians, Arab Muslims all coexisted in Jerusalem. Jews owned property. There were burial sites all throughout Jerusalem that were Jewish. And in fact, one of the things that happened in that 20-year period from 1948 to 1967 is the mass desecration of Jewish graves. You can still see there's a whole, when you go to the Kidron Valley, which lies east of Jerusalem, you will see this entire cemetery where the caskets, the grave sites, are all still demolished. And what we were told was Israel decided not to rebuild, partly because they couldn't find they wouldn't know what went where, and part of that was also a memorial to say this is what has been done to our people. When we're talking about Jerusalem and Israel's claim to Jerusalem, understand that part of that was not just a claim to Jerusalem as a nation, but it was also protecting and allowing Jews who legally owned property, who were kicked out of it, to come back to that. And that's a whole messy thing, right? But just kind of tracing the history, understand that in the history of Israel from 1948 until today, the provocation, the big escalated wars have always been Arab Muslim population radicalized. Let's give credit where credit's due. In the last 10 years in particular, there's been a watershed movement on the part of Arab Muslims toward finding a way to create a peaceable future for all of them. You're looking at, with the most recently, Saudi Arabia was beginning to make some overtures. We see with Jordan, with UAE, with Dubai. I mean, there's some huge peace deals that happened with the Abraham Accords that most people never thought would be possible. And it is because a lot of the Arab nations, two things are happening in the Arab world. One is never mistake Iran for the rest of the Muslim world. Iran is Persian by nature. Iran has a different form of, there's this Sunni Shiite divide that goes all the way back to post-Muhammad. But it's not merely, right? Iran they don't speak Arabic. I believe it's Farsi. Iran, there's this battle between the Persian Gulf. Do you call it the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf? Because it's that ethnic tribal tensions that are there. The tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran are just that. They are sectarian. Iran and Saudi Arabia are completely different forms. Sunni in Saudi Arabia, Shiite in the form of Iran. But you've also got this cultural thing where Iran is proudly Persian, and the most of the Middle Eastern world is proudly Arab, and so you've got those tensions. And then the fact is that Iran has had for decades tried to have outsized influence on that region, and so it with the breakdown of Iraq, which was largely the United States' fault, right? And I have no problem taking out Saddam Hussein. He was as bad a man as it could. But if you recall, the Bush administration had no plan in place. They disbanded the Iraqi army when they toppled Saddam Hussein, and Iraq is still left as a rubble and in ruins, with anti-American hatred, and you can name it, right? So we created a vacuum. Iraq was the biggest barrier to Iran. It was militarily stronger than Iran. It had Western connections until Saddam started getting outsized ego. But even in his outsized ego, he was a check on Iran. And when that collapsed and created a vacuum, Iran got more and more powerful. And I was just reading an article today about the Biden administration and Obama. It started under Obama administration with this just stupidly fanatical, just naive. You talk about, again, I started this conversation talking about depravity. Here's a great example: is some genius in the Obama administration started to do outreach to Iran. We've seen this before, where whether you're talking about Venezuela or Cuba's another great example of naive statesmanship, where someone comes along and goes, we've been picking on these people for too long, but if we just sat down with Fidel and just kind of had coffee, maybe they have a right to be angry at us, rather than saying, you know what, we were right to be keeping a wary eye on these people because they're evil. Because what we're seeing is, for name one good thing that's come out of the last 15 years of our engagement with Iran. Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon than they've ever been. They've gotten better at taking money and using it to build bomb-proof bunkers and protect themselves. They have in no way, if anything, we know they have increased. With the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that there is intelligence that proves that Iran was coordinating this surprise attack with Hamas, providing intelligence. And by the way, you think about, Israel is not foolish. They know that Hamas is getting armed and rearmed every day through clandestine ways, and usually through humanitarian deliveries. You're listening to how Israel is shutting down the electric grid and how they're shutting down delivery of food and all this other stuff. Well, keep in mind that Israel has had to live with the fact that as they allow food shipments and fuel shipments, that nefarious players are finding ways. You look at how after a couple of years ago, Hamas launched rockets, thousands of rockets. Now all of a sudden they've got thousands of more rockets to launch. What's happening? Well, it's coming in mostly through Iran, South Korea. We've got these clandestine ways that they're smuggling it in. And so here's this reminder that, we've got these people that represent our government, our State Department, that have these naive views. I remember the infamous Hillary Clinton hit the reset button with Russia, the infamous interview where Obama's, before his second election, talking to Russian officials saying, hey, look it, when I get reelected, now we'll have more flexibility. We got this short-term memory that now all of a sudden Republicans and Democrats are all waving this blue and yellow flag in the name of Ukraine. But just a couple election cycles ago, we were told that, Russia's not a problem. Russia's tame. We're going to reset our relationship. And doing the same nonsense with Iran, and look at what it's done. So all of this is to keep in mind that this whole region is immensely complex, and there are tribal problems, and there are national problems, and there are governmental problems. And through it all, you've got this beautiful moment over the last 10 years with these Abraham Accords that begin to see some radical shifts in where loyalties are. That the Middle Eastern world, many of them are seeing that Israel can help. Israel. One of the things that happened with the starting of the kibbutz in 1909 is that when the Jewish people came in and they started reworking the land, draining the swamps, making it habitual to live in, getting rid of the swampland, cleaned up the mosquitoes and lessened malaria. And now it gave them fertile land to have agriculture and they started technologically improving this place that hadn't been improved for 1,000 years, and they were willing to share this knowledge with their Arab neighbors, most of whom resisted that, wanted and attacked. There's evidence again and again of kibbutzes being attacked again and again, to where they had to. This is where they started to arm themselves against. It was illegal for them to arm themselves because of the British control. But they had to by necessity because they were constantly being attacked for just being in the land. So it's important to see that there's this unbroken history of aggression within the land of the people that were supposed to kind of coexist. And it was never, it was rarely, I would say never, it was rarely the provocation of the Jews. Almost every time when you're looking at the kibbutzes and things, the provocation against them was directed by them. But like I'm trying to say is, we got to be very careful to not draw broad strokes when you need a finer brush here. We're talking about Palestinians. Palestinian Authority owes much of the violence is owed to them for being, among other things, endlessly corrupt, greedy beyond measure, and kind of playing both sides of the issue. We got evidence, if Palestinian intelligence cooperates with Israeli intelligence, but they also cooperate with Hamas. They're kind of try to stick in the middle so that they have they need the Israeli government to give them the illusion of power. They need Hamas to give them the credibility that they are anti-Israeli. But that's why I say is the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah. There's all sorts of, I don't know, Hezbollah is Lebanon and it's up north, but they are all, partnering together in this attack. And it's important to see there were signs in New York, in the New York ones, and I assume in London and everything else. But you got to look for this one phrase that comes up over and over again, and it's from the river to the sea. And what that means is from the Jordan River, which is the eastern boundary of Israel, to the Mediterranean Sea, which is the western border of Israel. That is the rally cry of militant Palestinians to eradicate, and that's the language, to eradicate Jews from the land of Israel. No two-nation status, no kind of coexisting. From the river to the sea, that is the mandate that they see, that they want them eradicated from the land. That was theirs, so it's important here that when we're talking about this escalation with Hamas, this is, as far as war is concerned, it's always dirty. It's always messy. That's another thing as Christians we have to wrestle with. But when we're talking about a war, innocents will always die. There's no clean war. The issue is what do you do to limit the casualties as best you can? But there is, sometimes in war there is a right and a wrong, and in this particular case, Hamas has brought every bit of every bit of the response upon itself. That they've been an irritant, a murderous irritant for a long time, but this one is a stark reminder to the world that there is a form of malevolent anti-Semitism that is not just about name-calling, that it is about the destruction, the degradation of the Jewish people. And that's where you talk about someone like Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, and in his very public and anti-Semitic language. One of the things that we needs to be addressed here with this anti-Semitism is that when we dehumanize a whole group of people, when we take their dignity from them, do not be surprised when people actually literally strip people of their humanity, their dignity, and their worth. And that's what we're seeing generation after generation. Palestinians have growing up, especially in Gaza, with the language of Israel, the Israelis, Jews are subhuman. And so they're being treated as they're being taught. So, I've said before, I'm radically pro speech. I think all these protests are good. Let them protest, because you're now seeing right in front of your face the way people believe. You can see people that were watching these images of women being brutalized, families being slaughtered, and you're seeing celebrations in the streets. That says a lot about them. And pay attention to what they're saying. Pay attention to who's giving them attention. Some of the sympathies that you're seeing here. There ought to be no sympathy for Hamas. It ought to be, the whole world ought to be united. If you want to end the destruction and the loss of innocent lives, then let all the world's governments say, okay, let's treat Hamas like we did ISIS. Here's the card. Remember the infamous deck of cards during the silliness of the Bush administration? But in seriousness, they put 52 of the most wanted ISIS leaders and said, we want these people arrested, dead, whatever. That's a good start, is to say, here are the Hamas leaders. And until Hamas is eradicated, we're not going to stop. And that would be a start. But what we're seeing instead is, let's push for a ceasefire. Well, a ceasefire is only going to embolden Hamas. It's going to allow them to regroup, lick their wounds, and let their friends in Iran and other places. Again, hard to say, but our government's becoming closer and closer to a friend of Iran. We just gave them $6 billion for 5 hostages that we had. You got to love that. We did an equal exchange, 5 for 5, but we had to throw in $6 billion on top of that. We need some serious people engaged in the world. And again, people that look at human nature and for the seriousness of what it is. Some people are evil. They're not redeemable. Their philosophy, what they believe, is irredeemable, they need to be treated like the serious threat that they are. Take Iran, Syria, the Iranian government. Again, you got to love. Iranian people are just begging to be released from these foul leaders that they're stuck with, and yet our government is appeasing these people, and we've got to put an end to that. We've got to call out and just say, look, for 50 years now, Iran has continued, if nothing else, consistently called for the destruction of Jews and for Israel, eradication. Take them seriously. Believe what they're saying. Don't think that, if we just have this conversation or we give them $6 billion, we're just going to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya together. No. Iran is going to use every resource in its power to use that $6 billion in nefarious ways to continue to destabilize Syria and the Middle East. Remember, Iran's influence is not only Iran's goal is not only the eradication of Israel. It's there, it's front and center, but it's to destabilize the Arab world as well. And that's why you look at these partnerships, is because, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan are all looking at the fact that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's not just Israel that's a danger. It's that whole region, because Iran's got that kind of suicidal, malevolent, evil leadership. These are people that are murdering their own people. And they've got designs on that whole Middle East. They are someone to take seriously, and it's an interesting thing. It'll be interesting in the days to come to see if Israel includes its military strikes on Iran at some point of this. If it doesn't, again, keep in mind that Hamas is only a puppet of Iran at this stage, and so as long as Iran is allowed to continue to influence that region, and as long as we fund them and we support them, and then make no mistake, the world sees when we are groveling to the Iranians, that's a world that is kind of primitive in power. It knows strength, and not, it looks at debates and conversation as weakness, and certainly they're playing us the way they have. When you look at this whole Russian, Ukraine, China, this kind of coalition, South Korea, they're all emboldened right now. The whole world is the whole world of kind of your most evil players are all kind of just running amok, and maybe that's another thing that we ought to be paying attention to is as we're looking at Hamas exploding is we got Hamas, we've got Russia, we've got China threatening every day, not just Taiwan, but certainly Taiwan. And then we've got North Korea is starting to stick their nose in things again, and not only giving military hardware to Russia, but just getting bigger on the global stage again. These are all real problems because these are people that really want to make a mess of things and don't care what the consequences are. You look at Kim Jong-un, what he does to his own people. He doesn't care. So want to wrap things up, right? So it's not the end of the... Look, I've said this before. You cry, Peter crying wolf, you cry wolf enough times, the wolf's going to be there. Eventually the Bible does say that human history is reaching an end. There will be a wrapping up of this age, and Christ will enter in and resolve and redeem all things. That day will happen. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. These kinds of things have happened in the past. They will happen again. The bigger issue is looking at really what does it say about human nature and and not being naive towards evil. Believe Hamas when Hamas says, believe Hamas not when it's suing for peace. Believe Hamas when they think they've got a position of strength. Believe your eyes. Israel has not gone into neighborhoods, Arab neighborhoods, and sought out Arab women and children and slaughtered them and raped them and kidnapped them. This isn't the first time, though, that Hamas has done these things. On the scale of this is brutal. But the dehumanization of Jews is something that Hamas and in the West Bank has been occurring. I was just looking, there was a story there of one of the things that's been a problem is the idea of dehumanization is Palestinian textbooks that they give to children. And just in May, the European Union, very much sympathetic when you look at their voting record to the Palestinians, they even issued a report condemning the European Union Parliament in May of this year, issued a report condemning Palestinian textbooks for the language of dehumanizing and degrading Jewish people. There was in one of the textbooks they called this woman, I want to get her name, Dalal al-Mughrabi. She assassinated 38 Israelis, including 13 children, and they treated her in these textbooks as a heroine. So again, you see in just regular Palestinian life, not just in Gaza and Hamas, but the West Bank as well. There's this fomenting of the acceptability of violence against Jewish people. And that's not to say that there aren't problems in Israel. That's a whole story for another day. Yes, you have some of the settlements, the illegal settlements, where you have radicalized Israelis who will look to victimize Arabs in retaliation for what they see as perceived acts of violence against them. That's bound to happen when you've got mutual hatred. We just saw images a week ago, and the government of Israel condemned it of ultra-Orthodox Jews spitting on Christian pilgrims in the old city of Jerusalem. That happens. I mean, and you just got to, some of that you got to take for what it is. I understand that the ultra-Orthodox look at anyone as unclean. It's part of their nature. Blessedly, the vast majority of Jews don't view us as unclean and unworthy, but there are those elements. It's like there's Christians that are knuckleheads, where there's knuckleheads across the world, and human nature being what it is. It is very easy for evil to take root and to create us versus them, dehumanize the other, and that dehumanizing allows subhuman things to happen to people that we have to reject and resist. The last thing I want to talk about, just to spur your mind, is early in the Christendom era, right? So for the first 300 years of Christianity, 250 years approximately, Jesus died, about the year 30 or the year 33, depending on who you talk to. So if you go by the year 30 or 33 to the year 311, so almost 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal. It was clandestine. It was beyond the shadows. There was no legitimacy to Christianity. So its growth, its progress, everything happened. The Christians died. Christians were arrested because they were an illegal sect, but they continued to grow and thrive and grow in influence. To the point when 311, when Constantine stopped the persecution of Christians, and then 313 legalized Christianity and made it the official religion of Rome. So that marks the beginning of Christendom, Christianity that has the power of government. Before that, for the first 300 years of the church, no one would have imagined the idea of the church with power, let alone the capacity of Christians to wage war on others. Christianity was a subversive movement. It's better that way when we're subversive. But once Christianity got into the corridors of power, now they've got a Christian emperor, and now bishops are elevated to authority status. The Christian church was given influence in the imperial circles. They're able to, give their opinions on wars and conflicts and civil matters, all that thing. They get their taste of secular power for the first time. It then raised the question with war. Is war ever okay? And of course, they defaulted to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, where war was often waged, and developed what was known as a just war theory. And to the church's credit, they did discredit kind of aggressive offensive wars, wars of greed, wars of, and these are things that happened and continue to happen, wars just to amass power, wealth, all those things. But just war was defined as a permissible act when someone needed to defend themselves from an enemy or to vanquish an enemy that was there. Now, this is one of those things that I as you can always already tell, is I'm an anti-Christendom kind of guy. I think the biggest error in the church was the love of power in the church. I don't think that the New Testament has any. The only concept of war it has is of holy war. God divinely, this cataclysmic end where the powers of God are allied against the powers of Satan. It doesn't mean I'm against theorizing. I mean, obviously there are wars, and obviously there are defensive wars. And certainly when you're looking at what Israel is doing today and the last couple of days and what it will do, it seems like it's the only logical recourse it has. To do nothing is to leave themselves at the mercy of an enemy who doesn't just want them defeated, but wants them destroyed. You can't negotiate, as I said earlier about depravity. You can't negotiate with that kind of evil. You can only crush it, and that's the only language it understands. But it is worth, that if as a Christian you can look at war, even the destruction, because again, even under the most legitimate form of war, innocent people will die. I've seen the pictures in the last 2 days of Gazan Palestinians, their children being, injured and killed. Especially the Palestinians are genius about dragging out dead bodies for PR shots. It was smart of them because it's a PR game, right? But that being said, until Hamas is eliminated, this will happen again. Hamas has proven itself that it will not just target military and not just kill and slaughter and maim, but also torture and rape and violate and treat, again, when people will tell you who they are through their language. And given the opportunity, it's like Jesus said about calling someone a fool, equivocating that with murder. Is Jesus' point is not that that the two are the same. His point was that what leads you to say that is also what leads you to murder, and that's the degradation of someone. It's just a matter of degree, and that's what we're seeing is you keep talking about how the Jews are subhuman. Now you're seeing in real terms right in front of your face the degradation of Jews by people who believe they don't have any human worth. And that is a problem. And so I'll end this by saying this is the most important thing in this conflict is to see that both sides are humanized. You can't, Hamas is an enemy that must be defeated, but in the end of the day, they are human beings. That's why, again, when you go back to our war against terror, I was very much against the torture and the degradation that we submitted these terrorists to. They are evil, and they do evil things, and that must not be. They need to be locked up. They need to be prevented from ever doing that again. But dehumanizing them makes us them. It's the whole point of who do we want to become. And part of that is always seeing that there is humanity in your enemy. They are evil, acting in an evil way. But that doesn't mean that, someone's quite capable of, it's one thing for someone to degrade themselves. That is something that you hate to see. But it's entirely different and that'll be a topic of another conversation. It's entirely different than when we degrade another person. That ought never to be done. It is a reminder that all human beings are created in the image of God, even the most foul and evil people. That doesn't mean they don't need, in this case, you're talking about a just war. This is probably as just as it gets. How else, you had no attempt to attack military bases or soldiers other than ones that got in the way. The focus of the attack wasn't on the military. The focus on the attack was on the civilian population, and that is the kind of the atrocity that legitimates the action against Hamas, at least in my opinion. So wrestle with this. It shouldn't be easy, and don't ignore. Here's an opportunity to see. Here we are, 2023, and we are no more noble than we were 10,000 years ago. Given the right opportunity, we will reduce ourselves to our worst elements. And that is, we will see, even in this day and age, people that will dehumanize, degrade, and devalue other people. And that is an evil that needs to be looked at and recognized and prayed for. So have a good day.